So today we're going to be looking at the archaeology and history of Cymru. This is looking at a very odd area in that it's looking at the Romans. Now, there are a couple of people out there who will be watching this video saying, Carl, you're obsessed with the fact that the Romans came to our land and they influenced this land and so on and so on. Last week I was criticized for a comment I made in last week's class in regards to the hill forts. Somebody said, oh, what you're saying that the Romans influenced us to create linear walls in hill forts. And I will stick by that statement because linear walls are seen in regards to the Roman period in Cymru after AD 43. And in regards to divisions in buildings, that's an innovation that we see associated with a change of who was in charge at that time. So I want to make it clear we're not going to be looking into the wherefores of a Roman fort. I'm not going to be looking into the barracks or which Roman legion was based at these forts or whether they were auxiliaries. But the main thing I am interested in is when the Romans were building these forts, I'm interested in the influence that they had on the local community and the influence that the local community had onto the Romans and what the local community did to these forts after the Roman military left in most cases tonight. So we'll be looking at Caerleon, Cowbridge, Carmarthen, Carnarvon, and then Cardiff. All of these had substantial Roman garrisons at one point in time or another. The Roman garrison at Carmarthen moved away and left the fort to its own devices. Caerleon is the same, and similarly can be said about Cowbridge. But the Roman occupation at Cardiff and Carnarvon lasted a very, very long time. In fact, from roughly the 70s AD all the way through way into the 400s AD. So continuous Roman occupation at Cardiff and Carnarvon for well into nearly 400 years. On this illustration, I think this is actually by Alan Sorrell. Alan Sorrell used to do a lot of work for the Ministry of Works. And what's interesting is that he's put some other buildings on it. Some are towards the north that you can rightly see, and some are towards the west, and some are towards the south. Now, these are the buildings that I'm very much interested in. Why these buildings are there. And what we do know in regards to Roman forts is that the Roman forts relied upon the local civilization, the local vicus that was established around the fort. What we do see is the traders, we see the shops, all intertwining with the Roman occupation. We look at prostitutes, we look at entertainers. All of those were accommodated outside the forts. And these would have, in the main, been local people. Let's move on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to make you smaller there. Good. So the first site that we're going to look at, to give you a little bit more detail, is Caerleon. And a statement that has to be made is that, yes, archaeologists in context to the Roman occupation of Cymru have been mainly interested in the Roman remains and not the remains outside the forts. These remains outside the forts have in some cases been considerable in regards to Carmarthen, in regards to Caerleon. what we see at Cowbridge is something similar, but not on this grand scale. As the Roman civilization had invested greatly into the Roman forts and the road network and the water network as well, when they left the local area, all that infrastructure was laid over towards the civilians. And the other statement I'd like to make is that the reason why lots of these forts are being abandoned and left over to the local civilian administration is because the conquest of Cymru was a walk in the park. There's no evidence of military conflict in Cymru. There's very little evidence of any resistance of the local people. It's almost as if Pax Romana fitted in nicely with our way of life.
I must disagree with you there, Carl.
I know you'll disagree, but I'm doing the lecture, Bill. But Bill,
carry on.
What I'm going to do, I'm going to take a note of that, Bill, and you need to remember that statement at the end, okay? I want to know why you interrupted there. All right?
Okay.
That's quite a firm interruption, and I like that. So we're looking at Cillian, which is there. And when we look at Cillian, one of the interesting things that I've noted with Cillian is that when I went there as a child, the focus was only on the military occupation. And then they said, well, the Roman military moved away, the Second Augusta Legion moved away, the civilians moved in, and that was basically it. It was that was all. It was a little bit of a subnote. There was an anal obsession with the Roman military remains, but we do now know in the past 20 to 30 years that the civilian remains around Cillian were substantial, and those civilian remains around Cillian outlasted the Roman military occupation in Cillian by hundreds and hundreds of years. One of the things I remember when I last went to Cillian was an intriguing enigma in regards to the amphitheatre at Cillian. And this interesting enigma is in regards to the siting of the amphitheatre. What the history books say, and I disagree with lots of this, is that history books tell us that when the fort was in its full bent of being constructed in the 70s and 80 years AD, the amphitheatre was built straight away. And I absolutely disagree with that. And why do I disagree with that? Why would you place an amphitheatre directly alongside a Roman military wall? A Roman military wall that was meant for defense. You are not going to be able to defend this part of the fortification with an amphitheatre directly alongside it. Some of the ditches being filled in, the vallum being filled in, to create the amphitheatre. I believe the amphitheatre is being constructed in the very late days of the Roman military occupation at Cillian, just before the Roman military is moving away. And I believe the amphitheatre itself has got more of a domesticated use than a military use. Because of its fine remains surviving an alteration, this tells me that this was used way into the post-Roman military period, completely contradicting the official evidence at Cillian. It makes sense. John was with me that day. And what we saw with the amphitheatre is lots of the material used at the amphitheatre seems to have been reused from other Roman military buildings. And that I will go down to any lecturer who would disagree with me on that, and I would argue them until I went blue. We think about the barracks, we look at the amphitheatre, and again, Bill, do you understand my logic?
Specifically?
Basically, if an enemy attacks the fort, they will
Yeah.
overlook the fort from the amphitheater. Is that logical when you're trying to defend the fort?
It will overlook the fort
Yes.
from the amphitheatre.
Yes.
When you say overlook, do you mean view it? Because
You
they're outside the wall.
yeah, the amphitheater itself is
Yeah.
meters and meters towering above the
It's
fort.
higher. Yeah. So you'd see that obviously from a distance. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is my problem. But then we move on to the other point. What the archaeologists have been doing, they've known for a long while that there's Roman remains all the way around the fort itself, all the way around along the riverbank of the Usk. What you do find is quays, various storage buildings, and this is a vast storage building. It's absolutely huge. And about 20 odd years ago, they were making statements that this being absolutely vast proportions. And this is what the LiDAR and the geophysics and the aerial photography tells us. In fact, the civilian storage buildings are far more impressive than the Roman military remains themselves. And you start to think that as the local people have taken on Pax Romana, it's almost as if they've bought into the Roman way of life. And in fact, it was all for them. They could reuse the fort. And in fact, the bathhouse within the Roman fort is being used for hundreds of years after the Roman military has moved out. These storage buildings are containing goods imported and exported from here and imported from various exotic places all the way across the Roman Empire, from Italy through to Syria, through to Gaul, and even into the Low Countries, the north of Germany. This is a substantial site that sees civilian coordination on a vast scale. This is actually, this is a reconstructed drawing before that drawing. Now, this is about 20 years ago. This is about 40 years ago. So 40 years ago, what they're saying, they're putting the bridge in, and what they're doing, they're putting a few domesticated buildings. But this area itself is vast. There is such a massive infrastructure. And there's more investment in the civilian vicus than there is actually into the Roman fort itself. I have been often to Camaron, and I've wondered why these Roman remains on this side haven't been excavated and displayed. And it's a bit of a shame, actually, because I, for one, would like to see the intercourse of our native peoples with the Roman Empire after the Roman military has left. But what we do see in the museum are a few of those signs of post-military evidence in regards to the civilians. This is a very, very fine mosaic. And what you are finding is lots of the evidence in the museum is post-military, which is great. You've got cremational evidence, you've got sarcophagi evidence. The sarcophagi post-date the Roman military fort at Camaron. Do you know, years ago, when I used to go in to see the amphitheater, now when I think about it, 35 years ago, it makes me feel old. 35 years ago, when I used to see the amphitheater, there were these sarcophagi there, these really big sarcophagi, about 4 of them. And I can remember lying in one of these sarcophagi when I was about 10. And they are now gone. But they are post-military sarcophagi. And so there's a lot of wealth being generated here after the Roman military has left. When you think about the barracks, you start to think, well, what's going on in regards to the systems that you actually see that the Romans set up? You know, Now, this is a good point to be made. Whenever I've been to Killeen, everything within the walls, you can hear me doing the diatribe. You can hear me saying, right, this is a Roman latrine. And over on the right is the Roman barracks, reconstructed. The originals are actually underneath this bank. And I say that you can actually see evidence of corn drying kilns, bread ovens. And you always hear me saying, like any other archaeologist, that all of those are associated with the Roman military. But I've got to rewrite that, because as soon as the military moves out, the civilians move in. So they must have been using this infrastructure. And the barracks are not in a good state of preservation, to be honest with you. It's almost as if they may have had another use afterwards. When I've done some of my other lectures, when you get remains that are in a really good state of preservation, like the archaeological remains at Great Zimbabwe, which some of you have already done with me this week and some of you will do tomorrow, you see that Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. And the remains are in a perfect state of preservation. Lots of the remains within the walls of the Roman fort of Killeen are not in a good state of preservation. And what we've done here, we've zoomed out of this wonderful reconstructed drawing. And do you know computer generated drawing? Do you know what I would like to see is what this looks like about 200 years AD alongside all this stuff. How does it all work? And that's the missing element, this obsession with the Roman military in Roman Cymru. And I use the word Roman Cymru because everyone in Cymru is classed as a Roman citizen after the year 212. We're not natives, we're Roman citizens, even though our blood is native. When I was thinking of this, I thought this is going to be a walk in the park tonight because it's something that I know about. But then I come across a cropper. I thought I know a lot about, we're now gone into Cambridge. I know a lot about Killeen, but I can't spend too long on Killeen. But I've already nearly done 20 minutes on Killeen. I wanted to go somewhere which is more familiar to most of you, Cowbridge. And some of you will be aware, I'm sure Goff will be aware, and I am aware, because we were in the area in the 1970s, and the 1980s, that Cowbridge itself was the place of excavations associated with the Roman period. But there's a problem. And there's a great problem. No matter how much I read, the military presence at Cowbridge is underplayed. And I don't understand that. It's overplayed at Killeen. It's underplayed at Cowbridge. The Roman military base at Cowbridge is rather important because in the archaeology, it's where we get the most evidence. It's where we get the most evidence associated with the pre-medieval side of this locality. And what I mean by that, there's very little in the way of prehistoric remains in Cowbridge. So we just got the Roman period and then we got the medieval period. Now, whenever anyone thinks about Cowbridge, they think of the Roman road. This is the Roman road, the Julius Maritima. And going up from Crack Hill all the way through, you take an alignment all the way through, and that arrow itself is going over to St. Hilary. And over on that side is Stalling Down. And this is the route of the Roman road. But one thing about the Roman road, it's overplayed. It's really overplayed. Because after the Roman military had left Cowbridge, the Roman road was not really maintained. So what we're talking about then is what was the trading communication with Cowbridge. It was obviously the River Thor. That would have been a lot more managed in the Roman period. So without the military to maintain the Roman road fell into a deplorable state. But let's look at the civilian side of Cowbridge itself. Bovium, otherwise known as Bomium. Now, this itself is Eastgate, so that's Eastgate, and going all the way down. Interestingly enough, this is when there was still train station remains in Cowbridge and a bit of the train track. The Roman remains themselves are more towards this side of the town into the high street. But when any archaeologist is called out to examine any of these gardens, there's always bits of Roman evidence in these gardens, all of them. So in other words, if you need any work done in Cowbridge, an extension or anything like that, you need an archaeologist to supervise your work. Back in 1977, 1978, 1979, into the 1980s, Roman remains are being found. And this is known as the Roman lion. Now, this is an interesting object. You can see the scale. It's a stone carved Roman lion. Now, this was thought to be a Roman military Roman lion. This was placed above a tomb in an area known as Hopyard Meadow in Cowbridge today, which is Westgate in Cowbridge. When the archaeologists found this, they said this is to do with a military official. There were 4 of these lions apparently, and it was around a mausoleum because there was cremated remains at a mausoleum at Westgate, Cowbridge. And there it is. This was actually displayed in the Cowbridge Museum until about 2 decades ago. It was pride of place there, and it eventually went to the National Museum of Wales. Can you all bear with me a second? Just bear with me a second. I've just got to do something in the background. I need another drink. So if we could bear with me a minute, I'll be back.
The Roman soldiers in those barracks, soldiers, if they're confined to barracks, they're not that happy. So I'm sure they would like to get out of the barracks into the local countryside, meet some of the local girls.
Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, so what we've got is that one of the points I was trying to make was about the military side of things. And the military side of things in Cowbridge has been underplayed. But there's substantial military remains in Cowbridge. We've got the name Bovium Bomium. We've got the Arthur John car park where Arthur John's is based today, and there was a military bath house found there. There was Roman military equipment found there as well. There was also a Roman tile stamped with the 2nd Augusta Legion, but still a military presence has actually been underplayed at Cowbridge, which helps me out a little bit, because in the center of Cowbridge being excavated in 1977, this was the site of the old Midland Bank, which is now known as the Swansea Building Society, and this is directly opposite the old hall. And this was being excavated in 1977. This is actually a civilian house with a civilian shop in the front. And this platform itself is some kind of base for a kiln of some description. And this is great because after the Roman military had moved out, at the same time the Roman military moved out at Cleon, this shop itself dates probably from about the 200s, a civilian shop. 250, 300s. And obviously you've got lots of evidence associated with industry as well in Cowbridge. So it's a very important site in the Roman period. But when you look at the road as well, you think, how were these goods transported? And again, you're looking at the River Thor and the canalization of the River Thor and using that as a transportation link and not using the Julius Maritima. These are, this is a wonderful image. This is the Arthur John car park. And actually the remains still survive underneath the car park today. Now, these are the Roman military remains, but it's undoubtedly that there would have been a civilian use for these remains as well, which is great. There were burials associated with this site as well. And again, like Killian, the civilians moved into the area that the military was once based, either utilizing the buildings or in lots of cases that we've seen at Killian and Carmarthen and Cowbridge as well, that the material is used for those buildings associated with the shop front that flanked what was left of the route of the Julius Maritima. So what we're going to do now, we're going to look at Carmarthen. Carmarthen is a very interesting site when we think about the Romans. It used to be said that Carmarthen itself was the furthest that the Romans ever reached into Cymru. And that was gospel up until about 20 years ago, until students started to excavate lengths of Roman road going past Whitland and more or less leading all the way to the sea. And then what we started to find, that around the same time, is actually a Roman villa built for a local aristocratic family at Aberystwyth. And since that, we're finding Roman evidence all the way across this wonderful land of ours. I even mentioned it last week in regards to the hill fort at Carn-Yenny on the Clean Peninsula. I've also mentioned that in the Roman period at Carn-Yenny, we've got evidence of Roman material at Carn-Yenny on the Clean Peninsula. And what we also find as well is great Roman influence associated with that stone-built fort, hill fort at Carn-Yenny on the Clean Peninsula. But back to Carmarthen itself. The site of Carmarthen is a rather interesting place because the Roman military at Carmarthen were there for a very short period of time. Most of the remains of the Roman military site at Carmarthen were built out of timber, as you will also see with the remains at the fort at Lucha and the proposed fort at Llanelli as well. But again, what we do find at Carmarthen is a wonderful locality associated with the civilian population in the area. It's believed to have been the site that all the local tribal people used as a trading town. The name, the Demete, is a name that the Romans gave to the local groupings of people in this part of Cymru. It's very unlikely that that would have been a name familiar to the local people back in the Roman period. But nevertheless, let's get to the meat of this part of the lecture. And there's one interesting thing. They were excavating the remains of the civilian town in Carmarthen back in 2018. So we've got very recent information. There is an amphitheatre that you can still see on display at Carmarthen near the old Merlin's Oak within the eastern side of the modern day town of Carmarthen. Some of you may argue that Moradunum has actually got an association with a local meaning. But Moradunum simply means seaport. And then it's been bastardized into the name Merfyrddin, the place of Merlin. but it may be more to do with the Roman name than it might be to do with Merlin himself. And there's, if anyone's on the Arthurian search, there's one big link between Carmarthen and Caerleon. Both got an amphitheatre that has survived. And that sense of the Arthurian legend associated with King Arthur. But moving on. The local population very much absorbed and overtook the Roman site quite rapidly. I like this illustration. And why do I like this illustration? You've got the wonderful River Towy in front of us. And what we do find is, if I can get my little cursor in there, this is where the Roman fort was. And there's not much left of it, is there? So what was established was a Roman walled town. Now the wall itself would have come in much later, probably in around the 300 years AD. But that was well after the Roman fort had been abandoned. The basilica, the amphitheatre, the temple, all established along a main street. And there you have a bridge spanning the River Towy. This is like Caerleon, is like the water links with Cowbridge, is like Saguntium, Carnarvon, very much linked to the water network and very much not linked to the road network for whatever was left of it way into the Roman period. There's nothing other than the amphitheatre to see in Carmarthen today. There's nothing in the regards of Roman remains in Cowbridge on display today, but there's a lot more in Caerleon. But all of these three localities have something in common. Where are the domesticated bits of evidence? Now, again, we've got lots of images associated with Carmarthen, and I do really want to show you them. So in 2018, they found some really nice bits of archaeology. This is associated with an area of the old priory at Carmarthen. And they found evidence of timber buildings, evidence of wooden buildings, which would be the way things would have developed, associated with the developing vicus, or the town associated with the Roman military base that once stood at Carmarthen, long since deserted. And one thing I'd like to mention is that the word vicus is associated with a settlement developed around a Roman military fort. That happened at Caerleon, that happened at Cowbridge, and that happened at Carmarthen. The difference from Caerleon and Cowbridge with Carmarthen is that the vicus became a proper functioning town. It developed into a town itself, a very important town for West Wales. I don't think any of you have actually seen this. This is actually the head of a bronze head of Apollo that was found associated with the archaeological excavations at Carmarthen in 2018. And also this bowl. Now that archaeologist has been working in archaeology for 25 years, and he remarks that he's never found anything like this. This was a perfectly intact earthenware bowl. And that perfectly intact earthenware bowl was found intact because whatever room this bowl was in, there was a fire. And the timbers collapsed alongside the bowl, charring the bowl, but the timber itself protected the bowl from being destroyed and survived all those years through all the different stages in Carmarthen. And this bowl has been placed on display today. All the artifacts have actually been placed on display in connection with this site. I tell you what, this is a great screenshot. I've just realized that they've taken an image in the background and they've screenshot this archaeologist on top. It looks pretty good though. And there's actually a nice little petaled flower there. And that's going to be the maker's mark of this pot. It's very rare that you actually find domesticated wares like this associated with the Roman vicus anywhere, but it was found completely intact. And because it had those charred remains, it remained intact after all those hundreds of years. So as the archaeologists are excavating, they're excavating within an area of an old parking lot, and again, it's a wonderful taste of the civilian side of this ex-Roman fort. And look at all these bits and pieces. Roman Samian ware. Within the excavation, they found over 2,000 fragments of domesticated non-military tablewares associated with the civilian vicus at Camaron. I read in my notes, but I didn't dig in any deeper. What I found in my notes was that there was a piece of Samian ware that had a very erotic scene on it. But I haven't seen that artifact. But these are actually Roman Samian ware bowls that have been found perfectly intact. Well, when I say start again, these Roman Samian ware bowls have been found in a perfect state. They're not being moved around with. They're obviously not intact like the other bowl, but these have all been put together. They're not disarticulated. And the reason why that is that they're not disarticulated, because timbers have fallen on here and everything's remained integral to the spot, not mucked around by animal burrows and all the rest of it. And I know Peter's with us now. Peter, where is this?
Yeah.
Go on.
Sorry?
Peter. Where's this image of? Where's this Roman site?
I'm not sure. I think it's where I fell into the. Oh God, I'm not sure off the top of my head.
This is the Roman site of Saguntium. Yeah, Bill. I don't know. You didn't go with us on that trip to Saguntium, Bill. It was the one that you didn't go with us.
No, I didn't, Carl. I had to pull out. Yeah.
But it was a really nice trip because it's more or less an intact Roman fort, and this is one of those Roman forts that was not abandoned, but remained in use, and there's big tracts of it that has the Roman wall completely intact, and there's a really fine stretch of Roman wall over here. But you want to hear about the civilian side of things. The downside is that I've found very little in regards to the civilian site associated with this fort, which is a big shame, really, because the civilian site would have been extensive, because this fort was used over a very, very long period of time. And that's the problem. Archaeologists have been very much into the Roman military side of things and not the civilian side of things. There would have been an extensive vicus around this, just like the Roman fort at Vindolanda, which some of you have also been with me to. So there's the Saguntium site on the map. And it's key because Saguntium and Cardiff remained as Roman forts for more or less 400 years. Very, very powerful localities in regards to the Roman military influence across our land. This is a rather interesting reconstruction, and actually we've seen the ground plan, and there is the castle, there's the road that goes through it, and you would think that there's an extensive civilian population that would have extended all the way down to where the modern day castle is today. But this is an interesting reconstruction. And this is a rather interesting reconstruction because there are some civilian buildings on it. So I like this one. And this itself is leading all the way down to where the castle is, and a large Roman harbour as well. So I like this one. How many other buildings there would have been, we don't know. The big problem with this fort is that the fort has survived, but alas, all of this area has been built on, all of it. So it's very, very unlikely that we're going to find much in the way of civilian remains today. And actually, I said I wasn't going to mention too much about this, but when you go to this site, what you do find is that it's got one of the finest stretches of Roman wall that I know of anywhere in Wales. You know, it's a really nice stretch of wall, and me and Peter had a nice photograph taken alongside it, didn't we, Pete? With good old Roger. And you would, and unlike Killeen, but like Cardiff, there was no civilian change in regards to this fort because it was continually used by the Roman military. There was a point made this week in regards to this week's lecture that this site itself, after the Roman military left, it was probably completely abandoned. The Roman civilians, the Roman civilian vicus probably continued in use, but the Roman fort was abandoned. What we don't find in regards to this locality is much in the way of civilian evidence, because it's coming into the end of the Roman period. It's coming into the period where things start to break down. It's going into the period known as the early medieval period, the period of the Dark Ages, a period that we don't really understand. And all the evidence that we can actually see there is actually associated with Roman military changes, and it's all made out of stone.
That's one of the balls I fell over, and Michelle helped me up.
You actually fell in there, did you?
Not in there. No, one of the walls I tripped over.
Oh,
I thought I damaged my knees.
So in other words, you could have claimed on an insurance, Pete.
Yes, probably.
If you had made a claim, you would have been £100,000 better off. I've actually moved into this lecture a bit faster than I should have, and probably when we get to the end of these slides,
Cardiff Castle walls.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Now, when I back in about 1994, I applied to be a tour guide on the buses that used to drive around Cardiff for Guide Friday, and they gave us a load of notes, and some of the notes that they gave us referred to a Roman town that was built up around the Roman fort. Unfortunately, the evidence for the Roman vicus is very difficult to come by. But what we could think is that the Roman civilian vicus gave way eventually over the years to the Roman, gave eventually to the medieval town. So like Cowbridge, we don't have much in the way of prehistoric evidence in regards to the heart of Cowbridge, which is a bit of a shame. But these walls themselves would have been very familiar to any civilian. The Roman walls at Cardiff were rebuilt on a number of occasions. unfortunately, when you do go to the exhibition, very little to nothing is made of the Roman civilian harbour and the Roman civilian town that built up around the fort. But I'd like to say a little bit. This is, actually, these are some of my most favourite walls with any of the Roman forts that I've actually visited in Roman Britain. When you go inside the fort and you go to the back of the coffee shop inside, you've got a really beautiful stretch of Roman wall and you can touch it. It looks really nice. And the reason why I like it so much is that the building material for this fort was actually taken from quarries in Barry. They've been positively identified as Lias limestone from the Barry area. And these little holes here are actually, some of them are putt logs, others are associated with buildings that were built into the outside of the wall in the medieval period. And I love it that you've got the outlines of the red rather sandstone above the Roman remains. So there we go, Roman remains, red rather sandstone, and this is all being built by the third Marquis of Bute and William Burgess. And they're more of the walls. You can actually trace it all the way around, actually. Brilliant. I love it. Anyway, moving on a little bit more, let's try and get back a little bit to these civilians again. Again, Cardiff shown there, for those that don't know. Now, this is the point. Now, what we do feel is that the original Roman fort would have been very large. And when we think about the walls associated with the Roman fort that we see at Cardiff today, they're half the size of what the Roman fort was like back around 100 years AD. And we've got various different phases, and this leads us sort of onto the domesticated side of things. So what we've got phase one, a big phase, and then we got another phase, and we got another phase, and we got the final phase. And these walls here are the walls that you see today. And these walls would have been familiar to the later civilian population associated with the Roman fort at Cardiff. Now, this is completely wrong. Anyway, they got the reconstruction wrong here. I've just realized this. This is the medieval reconstruction, right? And what would have basically have flowed would have been in the Roman period. Let me get my cursor in. What would have happened is that the river itself would have flowed more or less down here. That would have been in the Roman period. And what we do know is that the medieval side of Cardiff and the Roman civilian side of Cardiff were very similar. What would have happened is that there would have been lots in regards to the civilian buildings in the Roman period, more or less where the medieval buildings are today. And there would have been various quays and various harbourage for the Roman shipping. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. You can call it a fairy story. A little bit, but it's a nice fairy story. A little bit down towards here, you've got the Millennium Stadium, right? Now, I was told when they were digging out the footings for the Millennium Stadium, they actually found the remains of some Roman vessels. And these could have been any Roman vessels. But for reasons that I'm not going to go into, though that evidence was never made public. If it had been made public, then we'd have so much more evidence linking the military side of things with the domestic side of things associated with the vicus around the Roman fort at Cardiff. And this itself is that little, that's the famous plan from, I think it's about 1622, of the area of Cardiff in the heart. And just a few things, just before we end. All these walls here are actually based on the Roman fort walls, and in fact, all the civilians would have been based in the Roman period directly where all the medieval buildings are. But alas, very little evidence has actually come to us. But I would like to say finally that looking at the coin evidence, and one other piece of evidence that I will mention, looking at coin evidence, what we do see is Roman occupation associated with the fort and the civilian side of things going way into the 400s. This fort was probably still being used about 420, 430 years AD, associated with this town. And then it led on to the later medieval town that we now have a familiarity with, Cardiff, today. And a final point is that I think it's still being done, but associated with Cardiff, the excavations within the walls of the fort at Cardiff, they have found tens of thousands of Roman bits of Samian ware. That stuff is still being worked on and processed even today by the University at Cardiff. If you ever get an opportunity to go on a course in the University of Cardiff, probably next year, you've got an opportunity to not only handle Roman artifacts that have been imported in from France, but handle some military pottery and also handle some domesticated pottery associated with the Roman period in Cardiff. So what I'd like to say is I'd like to stop there. And what I'd like to do is I would like to bring Bill on as part of this lecture, right? And Bill, we're going to go way back.
Okay.
Let me set the scene. What we're going to do, we're going to take us to these ruins. Right, I made a statement and I said there was little to no evidence of any resistance in the Roman period to the Roman conquest of Wales. We'll use the word Wales. And the reason why I've made that statement is twofold. There's no evidence of any Roman military damage caused to any of the hill forts across our country. There's no evidence of any fighting up the period to about 100 years AD across Cymru associated with native peoples and the Romans. And also, the point of fact is that the Roman fort at Usk was only used for a very short period of time, around 55 AD to about 60 years AD. The Roman military fort was basically sidelined and moved to Caerleon. The Roman military Caerleon simply moved from Caerleon up to Hadrian's Wall, and the likes of Brecon y Gaer, that was very used for a very short period of time. What I'm saying is that the Roman military presence was really not needed in Wales, so there weren't in regards to any tribes to subjugate for any length of time. So, Bill, you can talk.
Right. I agree with that in the archaeological record, Carl, but in the historical record, Tacitus records that there was a 25-year campaign led at one point by Astoria Scapula against the indigenous native tribes who they called Silures. We don't know what they were called, of course, themselves. It was such a hard campaign that he was reported to have died during the campaign, and then Julius Frontinus was brought in, and he was the one who drove the roads through what is now Glamorgan for quick troop movements, and he actually ended the campaign because of that. So that's my understanding of the archaeological versus the historical record about how easy or difficult it was to subdue the indigenous Silures.
I really respect your point of view. And so in other words, we've got an archaeologist and we've got a historian disagreeing, which is fine. All I'm going by with the archaeological evidence, and I do, yeah, Frontinus constructing the temporary fort at, for example, Monmouth, and we've got a fort at Abergavenny. Yeah, that's all correct. But
I have to say,
go on.
sorry, I have to say, Carl, the subject matter tonight is probably my favourite, because I think there's nothing more fascinating to me personally than the Romans in South Wales. And the more evidence is found, the better. And there's still a lot out there.
There is
somewhere.
still a lot out there, and
Yeah.
do you know, there's still a lot out there. Now, that leads me to a question. We are going to keep the Wednesday evenings. There will be 2 classes being dropped in September, probably Saturday evening, and another one that doesn't affect any of you guys. So what we're going to do, we're going to be focused on the Wednesday evening, and we might actually move away from the archaeology and history of Cymru to actually look at some areas of archaeology and history of Wales, using the terms properly, to other civilizations like the Romans. So that might be, we might visit and we might do these forts in great detail. So
Yeah.
if you've got nothing else to say, Bill,
No, I found that fascinating, Carl. Thank you.
and I wanted to put more into it, but no doubt we can come again at this. So I'm going to, we've got a few minutes because Michelle's looking at me saying your food will go in the bin if you don't stop soon. So no, she's not. She got a big smile on her face. So what I'm going to ask, are there any questions? Put your mics on, lovelies. Let's have a good debate. Goff, anything you would like to say?
No, it was very interesting, especially Bill's contribution that complemented what you said. Great.
That was good. I like contributions like that you can actually keep them to the end so that we can thrash it out. And we didn't thrash it out at all. It was one statement, my statement. I like that type of interaction. I like that. I want more of that. Peter.
Looking at that port that we were looking at up in North Wales, I remember when we looked at the picture which they formed of the how it would have looked didn't match up with the foundations that we were seeing.
I think you're talking about Holyhead, Pete. We went to Holyhead and Saguntium. Holyhead was very different, and you are right. The Holyhead thing did not match up with what, and that is the point. That is the very point. Getting reconstructions wrong. So you're right, but looking at another site. Yes.
Okay.
You are right. Pam?
I didn't know there was so many forts in Wales. I thought Clean, but I didn't know about the rest. So it's been interesting.
Thank you. Thank you. Pat?
Yes, I found it very interesting. I liked the aerial view of Saguntum. You know, that was a really interesting place.
Yeah, that's a nice view.
Walking around and seeing the wall and seeing the columns, you know, bits of columns left, and it was amazing.
And actually we broke in that night because it was closed. Right. Okay. John, this is you like this subject as well, and so does Bill. So John, I think you've got the last say tonight, but don't go yet, Goff, because I'm just going to mention one other thing. So John, you say something.
Yeah, I'm chomping at the bit a little bit on this one, as you can well imagine. Now, Bill, God love you, I never heard that Tacitus had actually made this comment. I've never come across anywhere, archaeology-wise or in history, that the Silures had ever been a problem to the Romans. And indeed, it always came over that they got on quite well, and the Silures did quite well from the Romans, and therefore had no reason to go upsetting them. The other thing that strikes me with this is the custodian of Caerleon, who is a twonk and is a nodding donkey, but that's another story.
Because he doesn't expand to understand what we're talking about, the nuances of actually the understanding of the archaeology. That's what you're talking about, yeah?
Yes, well, he actually stated at the meeting I was with the Living Levels, that this was not to me, it was to somebody else, that there never was any conflict between the Silurians and the Romans, and certainly there was no living records. But of course, he could be wrong because he's an archaeologist. But I mean, I am in his camp and Karl's camp with this one. And the other point, as I remember,
Finally, John, yeah, go on.
to Chilean was inside that amphitheatre, there was clear evidence that a lot of stone from the amphitheatre came from the military part.
Yes,
And-
you're right. Yeah.
And some of the there's writings in there as well on the wall round and about that very clearly must have come from the military part.
Yes.
And was brought into what was now the vicus, or then the vicus.
Yeah, that's right. Now, John, that is we're going to end on this point, right? Now, the one point I wanted to make is that actually there is some, you know, when I said that there's no evidence of any archaeological evidence of any conflict before 100, I've got evidence in the Vale of Glamorgan of military origin, which should probably date from after that period, which is in my own book. Whatever that is something else. And when we look at the villa at Lantwick Major, we've got the local people massacring groups of people coming over, but that's not the military side of things. The final point is that when we look at Chilean, what we do see is that John is right, and I didn't make enough of this. The material at the amphitheatre looks like it's been reused from the military stuff from the military stuff from the fort itself. The conclusion is that the amphitheatre was built maybe after the fort was abandoned, and that's a really important point. On that point, we're gonna call it a day. Next week we're going to be looking more in the way of churches. Next week we're going to be looking at churches, the final part of churches next week. There's lots to do with that. If there's no more questions, I really appreciate you joining me tonight. I really appreciate that. And if there's no more questions, then I'm going to call it a day. So thank you very much, Peter, Pat, Goff, Bill, John, and Pam. I'll either see you tomorrow or Friday or Saturday or next week. Thank you very much for your support. I'll see you all soon. Night, people.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Good night.
Night.
Bill, if you could send me some details about Tacitus and where he writes this, I would like to have a read at that. You've gone.
Yeah, he's gone. Anyway, it will be on the internet, John. Look it up. I'm going to dash. So see you, Pat and John. I'll see you soon.
Okay, bro. Thank you. Bye.
Night, John. Night.